We are back on the Rational Boomer podcast. Hopefully, your day is going well. It is Friday, and we have the good fortune to have another guest today. And this one is, I know, one that y'all like, Arlene Unfiltered from TikTok. She kind of blew up on TikTok. She's a no nonsense, how would I say it? She knows the numbers. I don't know shit for numbers. I get numbers from media and stuff. But Arlene, thanks for joining us. I know
Mhm.
you're helpful to a lot of folks that listen to the show. Those folks that don't believe me, they somehow feel supported when you walk in and start spewing the numbers.
Well, you generally are speaking the truth, and I come in and just give you some numbers to help prop up that truth. But yeah, you're pretty well spot on with everything. So I just, I'm most comfortable with looking at numbers so that I can say with some degree of confidence that this is what is likely to happen. That's probably comes from, dealing with a lot of data over time and what I had to do on my way to becoming a professor of political science. And so you always err on the side of having to look at the real hard data. And you never make sweeping generalizations about anything. You never make basically you always have to be careful when you're making any kind of prediction. And you always say things, as I have said from the beginning, since Kamala Harris became the apparent candidate, is that if the Democrats come out in numbers, especially in the swing states, Kamala Harris will win. And I have felt confident since the beginning that the Democrats were going to come out in numbers. I was not confident about that when it was going to be Joe Biden as the candidate. But as soon as Kamala Harris appeared, it's like, oh, this is the unicorn moment. We're done.
What's interesting is what you describe that you want to avoid being pretty much describes me, generalizations, going with the vibe and stuff like that. I mean, we come from it at different angles. Obviously,
Yeah,
you're
but we end
you're
up at the same place.
we do, and you're an academic, and you're a professor and all that stuff. And I've been on record as saying that I went to 1 year of college. I specialized. I focused on drinking and partying, and I was so adept at it, they allowed me to test out and get the fuck out of college after 1 year. So I have no degree, but I have a little college experience. So I bring that to the table here.
Yeah, you've
Well,
got a degree in life experience, which, quite frankly, you know what? When I got my PhD, the big joke among people who have PhDs is PhD stands for piled high and deep, meaning you're just full of shit.
yeah. Well, some of them are. I know some people with
Yeah, fair enough.
PhDs,
Yeah,
uh,
fair enough.
and there's some clowns like me that are full of shit too. You know, when I wanted to ask you this because I use this as an argument a lot with people. People will say, well, this is going to happen or that's going to happen. And they're
Mhm.
basing it on what they know from history. Like, no president will go to jail because presidents just don't do that. And it's my contention that's well and good, but it's impossible to compare from history what's going on today because things are so much different. We've never seen anything like this, whether it be Donald Trump's criminal activity or the election.
Mhm.
We're in a whole different parallel universe here. So to compare it to history, which is what we would normally do, it's hard to do that because we're in a different zone completely. Do
Yeah.
you, do you agree
Well,
with that or
well, yes, I think I agree with it in a qualified way.
okay?
Um, and the only reason I'm saying this is I just happened to be watching on Netflix a show called The Martha Mitchell Effect,
Yeah.
which is, for those of you who don't know, Martha Mitchell was the wife of the Attorney General John Mitchell, who was in the cabinet of Richard Nixon, and
Who went to jail?
he was one of the architects of Watergate along with Nixon. And the reason they call it the Martha Mitchell effect is because it is described as someone who's saying things that make them sound like they're delusional, that are later borne out to be the truth. And that's what happened to Martha Mitchell, compliments of Richard Nixon and her former husband. And she became famous because she was a woman who spoke her mind. She was a Republican. She was very much a supporter of Richard Nixon, but basically she spoke her mind and the men in power didn't like it. And so they discredited her. And later it was, as I said, borne out that what she was saying was true. But the point of all of this is that when I was watching this show, um, I I found it quite remarkable that they were talking about how Richard Nixon was very much about punishing his enemies.
Absolutely. He
And
had a
it was
list.
remarkable to see the parallels between Richard Nixon and Donald Trump. Now, the thing that's different that I find about Donald Trump from what has happened throughout history in this country is that he is quite overt about being a fascist. And when you have someone in America who is behaving and talking like a fascist that is about to come to power were he to be elected, that is when there is no precedent for someone like this in office, which is why I always believed that the American people will do the right thing. At the end of the day, you have 150 million people who are going to vote by November 5th. And there are enough people in America who recognize the threat and they will vote to ensure that he does not, bring this storm of darkness and evil across America. So whether or not he's punished in the form of sending him to jail, I mean, Richard Nixon resigned because he was afraid he was going to go to jail. So, I mean, you've had presidents in the past sort of hovering around prison and the potential for them to go to prison, and they don't. But I don't think that, I think that that kind of thing is more, it's like the window dressing of what we're looking at. And what we really have to look at is, have we seen anything like Donald Trump in his current incarnation? This was not in his incarnation in 2016.
No,
That is not what he did not act in ways throughout his term in office, with the exception of what he did with respect to the Supreme Court. He set everything in motion then for this move toward fascism. And you select a guy like J.D. Vance, you very clearly are moving in the direction of fascism. But one of the big problems is that half of America doesn't even understand or don't even understand what fascism is.
they're
And
too
so,
busy. They're too busy worried about socialism and Marxism, which they don't
yeah,
also
and
know anything about.
communism,
Yeah.
yeah, so.
Some people compare Donald Trump to Richard Nixon, and I don't know that there's some similarities. Certainly, Donald
Mm,
Trump has committed 10 times more crimes than Richard
yeah.
Nixon ever did. The big difference between Donald Trump and Richard Nixon is Richard Nixon was a lot smarter than Donald Trump. He was more articulate than Donald Trump. He
Yeah.
understood how politics worked. All of
Mm-hmm.
these things Donald Trump comes up short on. And I think people give Donald Trump too much credit when they say, well, he wants to start a fascist regime. He doesn't know what the fuck he's doing.
That's
This is
right.
just all reactive. This is just all emotional. What he's
Yeah.
done, though, he's been able to fall prey to those people who understand how to manipulate him, that do
Mhm.
want fascism, that do want to do these things. And he's just very malleable and he'll do whatever anybody says as long as he gains from it. So he's
Yeah.
nothing more than a useful idiot at this point for these evil Republican fucks that want fascism.
Hmm. Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. I think that the curious thing about Donald Trump is that he does have ideas about things. Like it would not be uncommon or unusual for Donald Trump to, well, as he's done in the past, when there was any civil disturbance, like during George Floyd. And other moments in time, his reaction is, well, why don't we just bring in the military? And
Right.
it's like, no, you bring in the National Guard domestically, the militaries for use offshore. in other countries, and him not understanding the distinction between those two. But just this idea, he's very simplistic in his thinking. He's very practical. So it's like he's got the military at his disposal. Why don't we just use them? And then, he's got the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the rest of the people surrounding him saying, no, you can't do that. That's against the law. And then he'll come up with another harebrained idea. But these are all things that just pop out of his head. And
Right.
he's got he's got puppets around him that will advise him and then just go do what it is that he wants them to do. They'll give him suggestions as an alternative to bringing in the military. And then he'll go forward with that, none of which is good for America.
Yeah, I was one that thought that he may not end up being the nominee simply because 78 years old, he's not in the best health, not the best mental shape, that all this stuff hanging over his head would crush a normal man. But
Mm-mm.
somehow he stuck around like a cockroach. And I guess it's because he's delusional and he doesn't realize how bad it is. I really get that sense.
Well, you may have to ask the question, you might want to ask the reverse of it, or the opposite of it, which is maybe half of America is delusional
Well,
because we don't see it for what it is. I had an interesting interview that I did with a young woman who is a recovering MAGA, but she came out of the evangelical side
mhm,
of things. And it was very interesting when she talked about how the evangelicals just decided that Donald Trump was their guy. And because he's saved, therefore everything can be forgiven.
right,
And so this is part of the frustration that many of us have at looking at Americans who are supporting Donald Trump. And, like in Nebraska today, or was it yesterday, they announced that the Supreme Court announced that former felons, um, could get their voting rights back.
right.
And I think it applied to like 7,000 people. And then people on social media are in hysterics about, you can't be letting these felons vote. And it's like, well, your candidate is running for office. How
Yeah,
is it that you're going to vote for him? But it is very interesting as this young woman who's a former evangelical who really talked about how there is a complete disconnect among a lot of Americans, and clearly half of them who are going to end up voting for Donald Trump, where they really can find, it's that Christian conservatism that drives the Republican Party that allows them to make excuses. Well, not even make excuses. None of the stuff is relevant so long as Donald Trump is saved. And so he could be anybody. Do you know what I mean? He could be
yeah,
Bozo the Clown, and that would be perfectly fine to all of them because he's saved, because
right,
that's what matters most to them.
right, right. You talked a lot. You and I both talked about how we always get these people coming to our DMs and our pages, and they're worried about the polls. They wake up every
Yeah.
morning looking for something to worry about, and oh, the polls say this, and the polls say it's so close. And I think you gave an explanation on one of your videos
Mhm.
that uh, how you should take the polls, and it turns out it seems like the polls right now, we know that they're notoriously wrong and have been over the
Yeah.
past 25 years or so. But there's a lot of manipulation going on with these polls. Just because somebody says they're a poll doesn't mean they're legit.
I think anybody who says they have a poll is illegitimate. Polling today is not like it used to be, where there was much more rigorous methodology applied to the act of polling. They were much more careful about who they were asking. They were rigorous in making sure that the population that they were asking questions of were actually representative of the people they were going to present this information to. But now, I mean, when you have an electorate numbering this time between probably 150 and 160 million people, if not more, there is no such thing as polling any number of people that can be a representative sample of the American electorate, because the American electorate at one point was basically just white men.
Right.
And so, and they were all basically of the same demographic. And so it's easy to use polling when all of the people who are going to engage in something are exactly the same. So it's a bunch of white men who are pretty much all in the same socioeconomic class. Then you could interview or poll or survey a whole bunch of white men in the same socioeconomic class and say, you could generally say, this is how this group of people are feeling. This is what they think is likely to happen. Or this is how they intend to vote. And then you could extrapolate from that or generalize from that, that this is the likely outcome of an election. But now what we have is we have a multicultural American electorate. We now have the genders involved. We have the race involved. We have religion involved. We have people living in different states. We have them living in different counties. And as a result of that, you cannot get a sample of Americans that is representative of all of those people. I mean, you could go into a county, for example, because that's how the election returns come in, county
Right.
level. You'd go into a county and you'd say, okay, I'm going to survey 100 people in this county. But the problem is what part of the county are they living in? Are they Republicans or are they Democrats? What type of work do they do? Are they male? Are they female? What race are they? Because in order for you to generalize from a poll, you have to have all of the people being surveyed identical. And then all you can say from that survey, the only thing you can generalize is that people who are like the people in the survey, exactly like those people, it is likely they will do the same things that the people in the survey will do. But you can't do that across America. So
So,
that's why these polls are ridiculous.
so in order to have a poll that may be even close to legitimate, you'd have to specify the diversity. How many white women, how many white men, how many women of color, how many men of color, what genders, what age groups, because you got boomers. If you're talking to all boomers, you're
That's
going to
right.
get a different kind of poll than you would if you include Gen Zs and Gen X.
Mhm.
So
And
that
and
you can't
and
trust polls.
that's right. And you'd have to do it within every single state
Right.
and within every single county to get to the point of, okay, if you're trying to predict the outcome of an election, you have to predict it at the county level because that's where we're getting the returns in. So how many votes for the Democrat, how many votes for the Republican in a given county, which means you have to have a sample, you're surveying people that are representative of who are the people that live in that county. And rural America is completely different from urban America on a million different levels.
Right.
So the polls mean absolutely nothing. And what we do know, I did a video, I think last week, where I looked at the 2016 election, and there were 264 polls conducted from the end of July until election day for the election between Clinton and Trump, and they all got it wrong.
Yeah.
And then what they do is after the fact, polling companies come back and say, oh, well, we were within 1 or 2%. But it's like if you got 150 million people voting, 1 or 2% is in the millions in terms of the number of
Right.
people voting. So it's completely meaningless. The other thing that happens, as was demonstrated in an article in the New York Times this past probably 3 or 4 days ago, is this is a place you have to be really careful when you're looking at polling information, because if they just produced the question and the answer and the media didn't editorialize or interpret anything and they just left it to the voter to take the information, the voter or the consumer would take that information and interpret it in a completely different way. And here's the example. They showed a poll of Latino voters. And in 2024, the split between blue and red was like, I don't know, 58% to something else, 58% for the Democrat. And for the Republican, it was like 38%.
Right.
So if that was the poll, 58% to 38%, just looking at that, you would say this poll is telling us that Latino voters are leaning in the direction of Harris.
Right.
But what the headline was, along with the other data they presented, is they said, okay, here's an estimate of what Latino voters might have said in 2020. And then in 2016, estimates, not even actual polls. And the headline says, Harris losing ground with Latino
Right.
voters.
Right.
And so everybody freaks out when they see this. But the problem is that the New York Times took took a piece of polling data and then grabbed some other data and threw it into the mix and then made up a whole story about it that wasn't even relevant, because the reality is why are you talking about estimates of Latino voters in 2020 and 2016 when Kamala Harris wasn't running? So what are you even talking about there?
Right.
But the problem is this was front page news of the New York Times, and the very next day they doubled down on that story and told it again in a different way. And so every consumer who hears about a poll is also getting that media company or that content creator or that influencer's interpretation and then support for the story that they're wanting to tell. So
You
it's
know,
all.
yeah, well, therein lies the problem I see. That's one of the biggest problems in this country. Once we vanquish Donald Trump and
Mhm.
MAGA and we get them out of the way, our biggest problem right now is the fucking media
Yeah,
because
you have
they
that
manipulate it. It's not about journalism anymore. It's about whipping people up in a frenzy so they keep
right.
watching so they make more money. And the
That's right.
problem is you got Fox telling one story, MSNBC telling another story, and we wonder why we're divided because no one knows the
Yeah,
same fucking story.
exactly right. And with respect to polling data, for example, which no one should ever pay attention to the polls, every single one of those media companies will take the same poll and they'll tell a different story.
Right. Right.
And
You know,
so that right there, the fact that you could have so many different stories associated with one poll number tells you it's completely ridiculous to pay any attention to polls.
now, to me, if I'm looking at this logically,
Mhm.
not academically like you would, but logically, we take a look at the polls. We see what's going on. We see who's showing up to rallies and that sort of thing.
Mhm.
We see that Kamala Harris raised $1 billion in 80 days, probably three times as much as Donald Trump. We
Yeah.
find out she has 400,000 people donating their time throughout the country. We find out that Georgia has more than tripled, almost tripled the people with early ballots, and it's coming from Democratic areas. So we know it's largely Democrat. We also know that Democrats are more apt to vote early. Those things tell a different story than the polls. To me, those things tell me this is going to be a much bigger win for Kamala
Yeah.
Harris.
Yeah, you really have to, I'm sure you've been doing this with your listeners and the viewers of your videos. Uh, is that one thing I've been doing is like all I'm talking about now is what's happening on the ground. It's the only
Yeah,
thing I want to talk about because you really have to refocus people's attention to away from the talking heads. And on TikTok, all it is talking heads, and it's speculation. It is the sharing of information that may not be based on the truth or fact. It's the perpetuation of content that is producing anxiety for people with
right.
no solution. There's no answer to it. And so what I've been doing is everything I'm posting now is look at what's happening on the ground. Look at what happened in Georgia. Where are we at with the number of early votes? How many of those votes did not vote in 2020? Look at, like you say, the 400,000 volunteers that are on the ground. Look at how North Carolina, the Democratic Party, announced today that they've already knocked on 900,000 doors. And when
Yeah,
you consider behind each of those doors are potentially more voters, which means that outreach effort of 900,000 doors being knocked on means you could be reaching 2 million people in that effort in just one state. And
right,
again, like you say, the amount of money that's been raised, Kamala Harris is raising big money from little donors,
right.
meaning,
Which mean
you
more
know,
votes.
that's exactly right. And with Donald Trump, you see that he raised $220 million from three people.
Right,
And so when you look at the disparity there, when you look at the number of times Kamala Harris has been traveling to Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, she's going after it and she's going after it hard. And anybody with this kind of an apparatus and infrastructure that is going this hard, she's going after those votes because she's determined to win. And there is nothing to suggest, as a counterpoint to that, that Donald Trump is doing anything even remotely like what is in place.
well,
So,
that's a good point. You know, what Kamala Harris is doing on the ground is probably unprecedented. That's an overused term, but I don't know that we've ever seen a presidential candidate to this extent have a ground game is this solid and is this
yeah,
extensive. Counter on a counterpoint, Donald Trump, he either has very little ground game or no ground game. And that's
yeah,
absolutely crucial in election. I mean, when you look at these factors, how does some guy who's losing popularity every day come close to winning when he doesn't have a ground game? He doesn't have the money, he doesn't have the people, and Kamala Harris is just killing it.
yeah. I think this is one of the really unfortunate things is that, half of America are Republicans. And the Republican candidate, this is the beauty and deficit of the Republican Party is that once they've got a horse in a race, they circle around that horse, and that's the horse they promote. And that candidate really doesn't have to work very hard to get their votes because if they're the Republican candidate,
Right.
the Republicans just vote for them. So, I mean, you could go through an entire campaign cycle and not spend a single dollar courting Republican voters. But in this particular election, because so many Republicans have turned away from Donald Trump, I can't say that he's hemorrhaging votes, but he doesn't need to. If he loses just 1 or 2% of the votes, especially in the swing states, um, like it's not, I mean, he's going to lose. That is what I anticipate will happen. It's just a question by how much is he going to lose? And is it possible that North Carolina, that has historically for decades now been a red voting state in the presidential races, with the exception of one election, uh, is it possible that that state turns blue? Well, when you look at the turnout in North Carolina today, um, you got to ask yourself, he won North Carolina by about 75,000 votes in 2020. Is it possible that, Kamala Harris can pick up 40,000 additional votes that she otherwise might not have? And that actually could come from Republicans who are abandoning Trump. And I think, I honestly think that it's going to be the Republicans that help close the deal on
Oh, absolutely.
Donald Trump's fate here.
Well, you said something just a moment ago, and I've heard a lot of people say this on the Republican side too. Brett Baer said it when he talked to Kamala Harris. Well, half the country believes this. Well, maybe
Mhm.
historically half the country has believed
Yeah,
this.
yeah, yeah,
Maybe
yeah,
historically half the country has voted for Donald Trump. I think we're going to see a change in this election. He's not going to
yeah,
get 50% of the public. He's not
yeah,
going to be that close because, when we talk, I've said this before, and you can tell me if I'm right here. There is no Republican presidential candidate that can win an election if he doesn't have a unified party. He needs the entire party behind him, and he needs help from independents. We know
yeah,
he's lost a ton of independents, and we know that the Republican Party isn't unified. By
yeah.
virtue of those people that are peeling off and getting away from Donald Trump, I just don't see any way he can possibly win. I don't see any way he can pull up anywhere near that 50%.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that, he is hemorrhaging some percentage of Republican voters, the new voters that have become eligible to vote since the last election, all of those 18-year-olds that are now between 18 and 22 that are voting for the very first time. The majority of them will go in the Democrats' direction. It is just simply a function of that voting block and how they tend to vote. There are more of them mobilized. You have people who have not ever voted before that are adults that have been eligible to vote for years that have not voted in the past that are now voting. You have other people who have not voted in the past few elections that are voting. And so those votes are clustering around Kamala Harris. And I don't see any voting blocks out there that represent opportunity for Donald Trump.
No,
Plus, he's not courting any of them.
no. Well, and boomers are dying at a rate of 5,000 a day. Plus, you had COVID. No doubt there was a lot of people that weren't following the mask thing and all that stuff. So there's a lot of the older people that have died off. Um, he the thing with the younger people, we're seeing a trend here. As I understood it, they're going to play a big role. Gen Z and millennials, they're going to play a big role in 2024. But I've heard it said that it come 2028, they're going to be the largest voting bloc in the country. It won't be boomers anymore. It's going to be millennials and Gen Zs. And if that's the case, the Republican Party is done. There's not enough of those people within the young group. I mean, I thought I've read things with Gen Zs or maybe it's millennials that 70% are Democrat. That's a long way to try to come back for Republicans who are in a party that's essentially been burnt down.
Yeah, I agree. I think that we're probably 3 or 4 elections away, presidential elections, like, almost a decade and a half, 2 decades away from there being a massive shift in the American electorate, and also the makeup of our Congress and our Senate. Because as you point out, the boomers, um, you know, a big chunk of that traditional core conservative Republican, they will die off in the next 20 years. And that really hardcore, solid conservative voter is giving way to other voters. And I think what we're going to see happen is a broadening of the base of more moderate to liberal leaning, left leaning voters because of the impact of the younger voter. And then on the right, you'll have that portion of the Republican Party that is there, that are sort of remnants of the old grand old party, but there will be an extreme component that remain visible because they are continuing to infiltrate. This infiltration started back when Ronald Reagan was elected, and we started seeing this Christian conservatism floating through our government and in our elected offices. And we're seeing a lot of this at the local level where, like, school boards in certain parts, like in Florida and a couple of other states, the Moms of Liberty or Moms for Liberty are getting themselves elected to school boards, which are
Right.
now banning books. They're trying to decide what the curriculum is. This whole thing around critical race theory, they're basically trying to make it so that they are erasing history and replacing it with their own version of something, which sends us back into the traditional 1950s model of Christianity in white America.
But I get the sense with the extreme right, they've got a little bit of a foothold because they hold a small majority in the House. They can still dictate some things. But
Mhm.
once they're eradicated from Congress to the extent they're in there now and
Yeah.
the presidency, I feel like MAGA may not go away. They're like a bad infection. It's going to take a while, but they'll ultimately go the way of the Tea Party. And and then you've got the conservative people that will come back and try to rebuild the Republican Party, but
Mhm.
but what they're doing is will be archaic with all these young
Yes,
people come in.
yes.
So they've got to come back in a totally different form if they want to have any power in future elections.
Yeah, I think that that's such a great point. Um, I think that whatever Republican Party emerges out of this, where all of these old guard Republicans like Liz Cheney, Dick Cheney, Karl Rove, all the rest of them, there it's a generational thing, and that we really are one generation removed from a Republican Party that is going to become extinct. There will be a Republican Party, but the face of it is going to be different, and everything about it is going to be different, because I think that you will see a more multicultural face of a Republican Party. It will be less white. And whomever goes in that are not white will not be extreme conservatives. It will be simply their fiscal conservatives. You know, they'll have bought into the same crap of Reaganomics and all this other economic, bullshit,
Yeah.
which continues to suggest that somehow the economy is always better under Republicans, when we know for a fact that Republicans destroy our economy and it's left to Democrats to fix it. So, you know, I really agree that I think that the Republican Party, as we have known it for our generation, that is coming to a close, and it remains to be seen in what face is it remade, or in whose face will it be remade.
What amazes me, what I see for Donald Trump, he's going to lose the election. He's going to go on trial. In terms of him going to jail, like you say, it may not matter because he'll fade away. He maybe never will go to jail, but because he won't survive that long.
Yeah.
But in terms of the crimes that he's going to be tried for and the crimes he's already been convicted of,
Mhm.
I don't see any other option. If he's alive, he's got to go to jail. These are pretty egregious crimes, regardless of whether or not he was president or not. Because I'll tell you this, people will say, well, if we put a president in jail, it'll cause divisiveness. I'm going to tell you this, if he isn't held accountable, that'll be more divisive and more damaging to the psyche of this country than not or than putting him in jail. People are ready for this. They need to see that he's accountable for the crazy
Yeah.
shit he's done.
Yeah, I think it really depends on how the judge, and what kind of sentencing precedents have been set for the types of crimes that he's committed, and the extent to which they treat them as like white collar crimes, or that they don't rise to the level of a certain type of incarceration. What I think will happen more than anything else is that even if he were to be sentenced to prison, his lawyers will be appealing this
Yeah,
forever. And
yeah.
he will die before he ever sees the inside of a jail cell. But I do think it would be very um, uh, vindicating for the American people for him to be sentenced to prison. Whether or not he ends up there is second to the fact that he is a felon, and the judge has sentenced him to prison, and then everyone in America can feel satisfied that justice was served.
I'm curious. I know what's going to happen to Donald Trump. I said early on, before we knew all we knew now, I said I don't know that he'll go to prison. I just want to see him walking around Manhattan, screaming at buildings, wearing shitty pants, and just lost everything. I'd be happy with that. Um, and it seems like we're already getting that, so that's good. If he goes to jail or at least sends to jail, that's one thing. What I'm totally confused about is these people, younger people, people that have futures and families and need to work, that have stood by his side up to the last moment here as we get close to November 5th. Donald Trump's going to be, he's going to be like Richard Nixon. He's going to be a pariah. He's going to be the butt of jokes. He's going to be the exact opposite of what he wants it to be.
Mhm.
And so, what are these people? How are these people going to redeem themselves and try to earn a living back in politics after they stood by this clown's side up to the last minute?
Well, a lot of these people manage to resurrect their livelihoods and futures. I mean, look at the young woman, what was her name? Cassidy Hutchinson.
Right, right.
Uh, I mean, she was working directly with Donald Trump. She was
But she
part of
got
the,
out in time.
yes, she did. But that's the thing is that, the the institutional memory and the memory of American people and even employers at this moment in time with, you know, nonstop content generation, the history is old news a day later. And so, if they have a skill set, they'll find somebody on the Republican side to hire them. I don't think that, especially now, I don't think that the people who are working for him will face as much difficulty as they may have after he came out of office in 2020. And then you've got the insurrection and everything. I think those people who work for him were more tainted than those who are working for him now, because it's very clear that his own people are trying to get him to stop doing what he's doing, and he's just not listening to anyone. And so it's kind of hard to hold people responsible or accountable for anything having to do with Donald Trump right now, because like no one's responsible or accountable for him except for him. And then the reality is that anybody who's going to go work for him anyways, I mean, they can go work for the Heritage Foundation and write the next version of Project 2025. You know what I mean? There are just institutions and organizations out there, or they go into the private sector, they work on Wall Street, they disappear, make $1 million, and then they come back into the public sector with somebody else.
Right. I think that, let me ask you this, Arlene. Um, if you were working for Donald Trump and you advised him to do certain things and he ignored it, and then he went out and did crazy shit, what would you do in that situation? I know what I'd do.
Well, the problem is that we would never be working for him.
But say we were. I mean, if that, or say we were working in a situation with a similar personality, just in a
Mhm.
different field, I'd fucking quit because there'd be no point in staying. And that's what I don't understand why they don't do that.
Well, these people are making a lot of money. They've got connections. They've got, they're able to leverage all of this. They'll go work for another senator or congressperson, or they'll work for a lobbying company. I mean, they, anybody who works in government at that level, they enrich themselves as a result of their proximity to power. And
Right.
so I don't think any of them care. I think that they think it's a real feather in their cap. It looks great on their resume that they worked at the White House, or they worked for this, this president or that senator or congressperson, and they just leverage it to move them on to the next step in their career. I have a real problem with the ethics and the morality, or the lack thereof, for people who are so opportunistic, who are so they're hungry for power and wealth and proximity to, whatever ways they can enrich themselves. And I have no respect for people like that, because a lot of people get hurt as a result of that behavior. And it's just downright selfish. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's individualistic, and they don't give a shit about anybody else. And I have no respect for people like that. So, they can all go pound sand in my book.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Arlene, we're going to take a quick break
Oh,
and we will be right back.
beautiful.
We are back on the Rational Boomer podcast. We have the good fortune to have Arlene Unfiltered with us. You see her on TikTok. I know you love her because last time she was here, you said that. She's gotten a crazy amount of followers in a short period of time. Mine just kind of keeps going steadily. It doesn't ramp up as quickly as you do. And it's largely due to the fact that she knows what she's talking about. She has the data and she's an academic. So it's easy to trust what she says. But when we talk off the show, you and I have the same situation. And to me, it was surprise. I didn't expect this to happen. I guess it's kind of a byproduct of what I do and what you do. But every day You and I both get people coming to us and going, I'm terrified. You talked me off a ledge. You kept me sane. Whenever the day's really bad, I listen to you so I feel better. This issue of people being terrified and having anxiety about all that's going on in this world, there's an upside to that. And the upside is prior to this, we had nothing but apathy, and that's why we're here. But now
Mhm.
it's going the opposite way, and people are being very anxious about this stuff. Did that surprise you when you started getting people coming to you saying, "Oh, you fucking saved me. I feel better"?
Um,
Or did you feel like that was a
you know what?
responsibility you weren't expecting?
It was more, I didn't realize the extent to which the way social media operates, especially this TikTok platform, which I still know virtually nothing about. I just
Yeah.
hit record and publish the video. I don't follow anyone. I don't look at the FYP thingy, whatever. I don't spend any time looking at videos. I'm not interested in listening to other people talk. I'd rather read. And so what surprised me, it wasn't that people were anxious because, people are living with a lot of PTSD as a result of what happened in the 2016 election, where everyone went to sleep thinking Hillary Clinton had won, and then they woke up in the morning and Donald Trump had won, and they never saw it coming. And so sort of this chronic state of anxiety and people's nervous systems being completely frayed right now is this sense that they're going to wake up on November 6th and Donald Trump is going to be president again. And the extent to which this feeling is being fed, especially on TikTok, by content creators who are just churning all of this stuff where in what the only thing I know about other content creators is what the people who follow my account are sending to me. And generally, I don't look at any of it.
Mhm.
But for a while, I was looking at what content were they consuming that was leaving them feeling so anxious. And I was only able to watch a handful of them because, with all due respect, there's a level of irresponsibility on the part of content creators that involves them not doing their research to check and vet the information that they are about to transmit to their followers, meaning they're taking something they've seen somewhere and then they pass it on to their followers, but it's like they're just regurgitating it and then adding their own editorial spin to
Right,
it.
right.
And there's no analysis being done. And what I find surprising, to answer your question in a roundabout way here, is the extent to which people are afraid, they're anxious, and all they're doing is reaching out, grasping at anybody who will help them calm down instead of actually using their critical thinking, their reasoning skills, and go and do some research to confirm whether or not what you're reading has any merit to it. And the absence of people having any agency or feeling like there's anything they can do about it. That, I mean, if somebody says something to me, the first thing I do is research to confirm whether or not there's any there. And there often is no there, but everybody else is running around like chickens with their heads cut off
Right.
because they're reacting and they don't even know what they're reacting to. It's just that it sounds bad. Only if you know anything about history, if you read anything, if you research anything, you'll know, oh, well, this is ridiculous. There's nothing there. But because of, in my limited experience with TikTok, the way that the information is generated and passed on and shared, and the people commenting, it's like this big community thing. What I'm finding is it's much like what is happening with the mainstream media, where all of these talking heads are not people who are researchers or academics or people who are experts in a particular subject area. They are well, they claim to be journalists, but they're actually like broadcasters. They're
It's tabloid.
yeah, it's all become tabloid. And even like, for example, I don't know if it's on CNN or MSNBC, they've got some, they call them the senior political analyst who's, polls left and right and whatever. But even that person's background is they're coming in as a journalist and they're considered a senior political analyst because they've looked at elections and they've looked at polling data from election to
Right.
election. And so the problem we have is that, like, what is the baseline of knowledge? Where is our starting point with the foundation of knowledge about anything upon which everything else is built? It's like there's no foundation. And I mean, in my experience, it's like everyone has forgotten what they learned in civics class and the basic operation of government, because, yes, you're in the context right now, the lived experience of going through a very bizarre moment in time with the American election because of this particular candidate, but that doesn't change how the government operates. But everybody's like, oh, these electors are going to refuse to certify this, and oh, what if the House of Representatives refuses to certify the vote, and then the Supreme Court's going to get involved, and then this is going to be terrible, and then there's Project 2025, and oh my God, what about the pets that are being eaten in
Yeah.
Springfield?
Yeah.
Oh my God, and everybody's just reacting because you know what they're doing? This is what they're doing. They're going like this. Oh, here's another video. Here's another video. Let me go look at this creator. Oh, let me go look at that creator. I feel better when I look at this one. And then they immediately see another poll and freak out and decompensate. So the shocking thing to me is the extent to which, in our cases, we will offer up that comfort and reassurance. And no sooner as we do that, there's another piece of information that people are consuming, and they're right back in the rabbit hole.
Well, I think some of the people on TikTok, some of the creators have kind of morphed into what the mainstream media is doing, like you said, in that, oh, cool story. I got to get that out because they're
Yeah.
chasing viewers. They're not
Mm-hmm.
worried about the truth, or they just assume it's the truth because it's what they
Mm-hmm.
want to hear.
Yep.
Now, I'll get people coming to me and said, I heard this guy said this and this guy said this. How come you're not talking about it? I said, because I just fucking Googled it and it doesn't show up in any mainstream news organization, good news
Yeah.
organizations. It's probably bullshit. And I'm not going to put my face to something that is bullshit just to excite
Right.
people. That's what
Mm-hmm.
the mainstream media does. That's what some of the creators do. And that's the problem. It's all about manipulating these people's emotions
Yeah.
and to be able to calm them down is fine. But what you do, here's the crazy thing. What you do, maybe, but certainly with what I talk about, anybody could hear a news story, Google it, read a couple articles from legitimate sources, and come up with the same information and the same analysis that I do.
Yeah.
But they don't. And
Right.
I'm not disparaging them for not doing it. People have a lot of things. I'm a retired guy. I got nothing fucking else to do. So,
Yeah.
but that's the problem, is there's so many different sources for news and none of it is news. Most of it is hype and bullshit just to freak you out, and you get freaked out. I learned a long time ago that I take all emotion out of it,
Yeah. Yeah. Completely.
because emotion just causes you to react improperly.
Yeah. And I think that the barrage of information that's out there, um, it like it, in fairness to people, it's probably hard to even get yourself in a mindset where you can stop long enough to evaluate the information that's coming, because, especially like with TikTok as a platform, there is a way that they have programmed that platform to keep people there.
Mhm.
I'll give you an example. The other day, everybody was freaking out. It was for, there was one content creator with a big following, and it was like he was decompensating when he was doing his videos. He could no longer come up with anything to talk about. He sounded like he was completely despairing about the election. and everybody's freaking out. I'm like, what on earth is going on here? So I did a TikTok live where I started it at 1:15 in the afternoon, and I think I finished that live at 5:30. It was just nonstop. It was like a 4 hour therapy session where
Yeah.
people are just so freaked out about stuff. But the thing is that no one's stopping to consider, is there a basis for being freaked out?
Right.
Like you really break it down and say, okay, what does this really mean? What is it that I'm afraid of? All these people are afraid that Donald Trump is going to be elected. Well, one of two people are going to be elected, and you're going to be confronted on November 6th or 7th or whenever everything is finalized with the reality of either Kamala Harris is the president or Donald Trump is the president. And if I think the one thing, if I have learned nothing else in my life that has been of the greatest benefit to me, is something that I heard Michael J. Fox say quite some time after he was diagnosed with Parkinson's. And he says, never live it twice, because you don't want to spend all the time before something happens living the anxiety of that thing. If something's going to happen, then you live the anxiety at the point that it happens. Because the reality is in America, we're going to have a new president, okay? And you will have to deal with whatever happens as a result of either one of them. And you have to look at, how does this change my life if it's this candidate versus that candidate?
Right. Right.
Every single one of us, we would be affected differently based on which one of these candidates is our new president. But when you really break it down into everyday practical aspects of things, okay, how are you personally going to be affected by this particular candidate being elected? You personally, because that's all that matters, because this is your own anxiety that
Right.
you are suffering with. And so, you know, for as high stakes as this election is, for the obvious reasons, um, we've been having presidential elections for centuries now. And America has survived. Our democracy has survived. It has looked different depending on what administration is in place. But for whatever reason, our democracy always survives. And
Right.
what I see happening in this election is that Americans have recognized how possible it is for our democracy to be taken away from us. And in the 11th hour, Americans always deliver.
I know how people, it's funny. I'm one of those weirdos. I have no anxiety. I don't worry about shit. I
Yeah,
assume the best. I assume I'm going to win. And more often than not, that's the way it
yeah,
works out.
I
I
do
don't
too.
know. I don't know if I'm willing it so, but that's the, but people, they'll listen to just what you said and they'll say, so you're saying Donald Trump has a chance to win? Just
Exactly. That is exactly what they'll say. They're looking for, they're like parsing words. They're looking for any little aspect that could give them a reason to not trust that everything's going to be okay. And what I always say is, operate from a position of strength. Nobody goes into a contest or battle assuming they're going to lose. Nobody goes into that battle with the fear that paralyzes and immobilizes them. Why would you do that? How can you fight if you are paralyzed?
right, right. And I don't know. I don't know how you feel about this because I'm sure you get this comment. There's one comment I get that I hate more than anything.
What is
It,
it?
it's when I say something or tell them something, they'll go, I hope you're right. Fuck
Oh,
you.
God, yes.
If you're gonna cry and whine, go sit in the
Yeah.
corner, let us finish this fight, and then you can come out when everything's safe. No, you
Yeah.
got to be positive. You got to be tough. You got to be strong. You got to be in the fight. Don't tell me you hope it. What you're saying is, I don't really believe you, but I wish it were true. Fuck you.
Yeah.
If you're gonna
Yeah.
fight, fight.
That's right. Yeah. What I've had to say to people following me is like, don't be afraid, be prepared. And you've got to do one thing every day between now and the election to make sure that Kamala Harris wins. You have to have some agency. And you have to get off your phone and stay away from the mainstream media. Nothing is going to happen between now and November 5th other than people are going to vote. So you may as well go and enjoy your life between now and November 5th and worry about it when that day comes, when people have actually voted and we start adding up the numbers. But between now and then, there's not one thing that's going to change anything that's happening. So,
Now,
why are you giving up your present to the anxiety, to the worry about something that may never happen? Do you know what I mean?
exactly. My wife will say something to me. She'll say, "Aren't you worried?" I go, "I'm not worried at all." "Well, you shouldn't worry. Don't worry." She goes, "Somebody's got to worry." I go, "Nobody's got to worry." I said,
Nobody's got to worry.
Here's what happens. You're going
I
to
don't believe
spend
in
the
worrying.
No, you're going to spend 2 months worrying, then it doesn't happen, and all you're going to do is feel relief. And you're going to forget about all the time and trouble you wasted worrying about fucking
Right.
nothing.
That's right.
I,
Yeah.
I I learned a strategy, or maybe I taught the strategy to myself. Whenever you're in a situation like you pointed out, where we got all this shit going all over the place, once you start trying to worry about and fix everything at once, you're going to fail. The
Yeah.
only thing you can do is take the biggest thing, focus on that, get that done. You get a win under your belt, you get a little confidence, and you go
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
next thing. The first thing
Exactly.
we got to focus on right now is winning the election. And then
Right.
once we win the election, everything else we have to do is going to be much easier
Yeah.
as opposed to losing the election. And people just want to take it all in and they freak out because of it. You got to just keep your wits about you and you
Yeah.
can't get weak here. I mean, this is the
That's
point
right.
where we need to be strong. And those people that
Absolutely.
want to cry, well, then go someplace else and cry because you're not useful to us.
Yeah, and the other thing too about doing one thing each day between now and the election is it gives you a sense of empowerment. It gives you a feeling of the fact that you are engaged means you are making a difference. Even if it's one little post-it note in the ladies' locker room at the gym, just one, because you are making contact with one person that could make a huge difference in this election. And so just doing anything, coming into contact with the people you're in solidarity with, talking to those people, finding your community among those people, there is nothing more empowering than to take action. And
Right.
it is the inaction that is feeding all of this anxiety. It's fueling it because people are like they stop at the point they feel afraid, they stop at the point that they feel anxious. And what you have to do at that point is you have to get in motion because if you feel some momentum, then you can feel some success.
Right, right. I think most people, when they see all the stuff happening, well, the election's one thing, but what about this trial for Donald Trump, and what about him delaying this and doing that? They feel like they have no control. And when it
Yeah,
comes to all these things put together, they don't have control. So by
right.
focusing on one thing, like you say, doing one thing, that gives you a sense of control and
Yeah,
will make you feel better. Do
yeah.
something positive, no matter how small. It
Mhm.
gives you a sense of accomplishment and it gives you a sense that you have at least control over that area that you're working on.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think too, one of the things that is really vitally important for people is to exercise some measure of self-control. And that has to do with if you are following content creators and you're consuming content that presents you with information that makes you anxious, but does not leave you with any options for what to do about what content has just been presented to you, then you have to stop following them
Yeah.
because it's feeding your anxiety. It is pulling you right into it and it's leaving you in a feeling of powerlessness. And this is the moment that none of us can afford to be powerless because we've got to put Kamala Harris in that White House.
You know what it reminds me of, those kind of creators that will say, "Oh, we're all fucked. Thanks. Turn it off." It reminds me of, and my wife and I had occasion way back in the day, and we watch all those ghost shows that were on
Yeah,
TV.
yeah. Yeah.
You know, somebody was going to go investigate a house, and the people in this house, whether you believe it or not, doesn't make a difference. They go in this house, and these people were terrified. They were having these horrible things. So these ghost hunters would go in, and they do all their little shit, and they go, "Yep, you got ghosts. See ya." No, wait, fix this shit. And that's
Yeah.
the point. There's more than just acknowledging that you're fucked. You
Yeah.
got to be helpful in some kind of way. You got to
Yeah.
have some kind of answer. And a lot of creators, certainly the media, don't have an answer. They just say, "You're fucked. Keep coming here so we can all commiserate together."
Yeah. And that is I mean, there is nothing more paralyzing than that. And I think one of the problems, and it's not the fault of the consumer, one of the problems is that there's so much happening so quickly in so many ways, so many areas of politics, government, and elections, international relations, um, uh, judicial stuff going on. There's so much going on that in the past, the volume of information that is flowing right now is on a level that I've never seen before. So people are being exposed to know so many things that they didn't even realize existed all of this time. And so for me, someone who has studied this stuff for so long, it's second nature that all of these things are happening out in the ecosphere, and I'm
Right.
accustomed to seeing all of those things out there, and I know how they relate to one another. But that's because I've been looking at this stuff for 40 years. And for people who are just coming into this world of politics, government, and elections, even if they were an A-star student in civics and American government and so forth, when you look at the complexity of this whole thing called our democracy, it can be very, very overwhelming, even for the most enthusiastic student of all of this. It's like information overload. It's like you're drinking from a fire hose or trying to eat an elephant whole instead of nibbling on the tail. And so it's not the fault of anyone. It is simply the nature of us living in an information age where no one's shutting off the spigot, even for a moment.
Well, what I will get people coming to me and they'll be upset or concerned about something, and they'll explain to me what they're upset about. And I'll realize you don't even realize the process, because what you're worried about can't happen. Like if it's a
Right, exactly.
state issue in Georgia, they're worried, well, the
Yeah,
Supreme Court will just overturn it. And no, they won't, because they're never going to get it. It's going to go
yeah,
to the Georgia Supreme Court, maybe, but
that's
not the
right.
U.S. Supreme Court. So they're
Yeah,
worried about the Supreme Court, and it's really not an issue. And I'm not suggesting everybody has to get more educated on this. Just don't worry about shit you don't know anything about.
yeah. Or at least stop yourself for one moment and say, why don't I start from the place that this is false
Yeah.
and try and prove that it's true,
Hmm.
instead of the other way around, which is everybody just assumes everything that they're looking at is true and they freak out in response. And the amount of freakouts taking place could be probably reduced by 90% if they just assumed that whatever they're consuming right now, like what's going on with this garbage, with this poly market platform where people are betting on the election, and
Yeah.
Nate Silver, the former reputable statistician, who used to be very successful in calling elections, he goes to the dark side. He's now working for the poly market platform, and he's making predictions, these wild predictions of, oh, Donald Trump is up by 72% to
Yeah.
38%,
Yeah.
or 28% in poly market, and people are betting on the election, and everybody else thinks that means something when in fact it means nothing. It's a gambling place. Like it's like roulette, spin the
Well,
wheel. That's exactly what they're doing. And the other thing about it is that if they keep making enough noise, all of a sudden more people will be throwing their money into that betting, which then means they can completely manipulate that betting environment so that the people who own it make the money and everybody else loses their money. Just
well,
like what Donald Trump has done with Truth Social.
yeah. Well, Nate Silver started 538, and he got some positive press because he was right about some things with 538. What people don't understand, they still think he's credible. He sold out 538, made a
Yeah,
bunch of money, and then he hooked up with the radical right Republicans, and he's
yep,
just playing their game to try to generate
right.
more money. So
That's
he's no more
exactly,
credible than anybody else on the Republican side. It's
yep,
just and you said something, and I said it too, is that when you watch people on social media. You expect it from the mainstream media, you don't get it. But when you're talking to a lot of people, there's a certain amount of responsibility that we have, that
yeah,
those people that recognize it. What I know about media, radio and TV, just by virtue of me or you sitting in front of this camera and having a lot of people listen,
yeah,
you immediately get credibility and people go, well, Arlene said this or Mike
yeah.
said this. And all of a sudden it carries some weight. I used to be a traffic reporter.
Hmm.
Now, and I was on every 10 minutes for 7 hours a day during the morning and the afternoon. And I did it for 20 some years, you know? And
Mhm.
after a period of time, people thought I was the absolute expert on traffic in Minneapolis. Now, I knew a lot about it, but they thought that just because they heard me every
Yeah,
day.
yeah,
And the
yeah,
same goes for those of us on TikTok. They think, oh, she's an absolute expert. Now you're far more educated about this than I am, but we are just people,
yeah.
and we are fallible. Maybe me more so than you, because you deal with numbers and I deal with bullshit. But the point is some creators don't recognize that responsibility. They're not
Yeah,
trained in that regard. They're looking, how many followers can I get? How much money can
yeah,
I make from TikTok? How much can I do this? And you've got to be able to recognize that. Otherwise, you're going to be misled a lot.
yeah, absolutely. I think that you as a creator on any of these platforms, you have a responsibility to the audience that is listening to you, that have put their faith in you. Um, you have a responsibility to bring something to them every single day that is consistent.
Yeah,
But it's not about you. It's not about your personality. It's not about you being an influencer thingy that they call these people. And that if you're having a bad day, you are not bringing that to your followers because they rely on the consistency as a part of trusting you
right.
and what you're bringing to them. And you really have to leave your personhood out of it. It's much like delivering the news that, I mean,
Exactly.
we used to watch, most people don't remember him, but of a certain demographic, they will. You used to watch Walter Cronkite
Right.
and what, and at the end of every newscast, what was the line he said? And that's the news tonight or something
Yeah.
like that. There
Something
was a
like that.
famous line that he said at the end of the night, and it was kind of like his way of reassuring the American public that this was solid information, they could rely on it, and he was just delivering the information because that was the news. And he was no editorializing. It was just, this was the news. It was based in fact. This is what was happening, and people could trust it. And I think one of the problems is the extent to which you can trust the information that's coming to you has degraded over time because the people who are passing on that information are not coming in with a base of knowledge that has a foundation underneath it. It is, we've grabbed this information today, so we're just sending it back out there because it's important for people to be aware of this. But no one seems to know whether or not the information they're passing on is even accurate.
Right. Well, here the interesting thing about Walter Cronkite, and again, we're showing our age by talking about Walter Cronkite. The old people know what we're talking about. But the interesting thing about Walter Cronkite, when he was on the air and delivering the national news, there were polls, and the polls were probably more legit back then. He
Yeah.
was regarded as the most trusted man in America.
Yes,
Now
he was.
imagine that, pick anybody out in the media and imagine them being classified as the most trusted man or woman
Yeah,
in the country. It doesn't happen anymore.
yeah.
I think what happened was back then, uh, news was kind of a public service. It was kind of a
Yes,
loss leader to the
absolutely.
networks, and
Hmm.
and it's my contention that when we had the hostages in Iran, and they
Mhm.
started Nightline,
Yeah.
and Nightline came on every day, and then it continued after the whole hostage crisis was over.
Yeah.
They realized, fuck, we can make money off of news. And
Yeah.
then comes along CNN and all this
Yep.
stuff, and then it becomes a money making
Mhm.
situation. And that's where, and then of course you had Ronald Reagan doing away with the fairness doctrine. And then it
Yeah.
was a free for all. You could do whatever the fuck you wanted.
Yeah. And I really like what you just said about news as a public service that,
Right.
when you have the monetization or commodification of news, um, and it becomes all about an exchange of money, then the news becomes subject to manipulation for the purpose of making money. And it's kind of like at one point in time, the airwaves weren't owned by anyone, they were owned by the government.
Right.
And so there was this, the news is a public service. So there wasn't any incentive to turn the news into something other than what it was. And even I mean, this wasn't all that long ago, but the newscasters in the form of Tom Brokaw and Peter Jennings and Dan Rather, they were considered serious newsmen. They
Right.
were journalists. These were people that were going out and researching the stories and fact checking them and making sure that the information that they were passing on to the American people was correct, that the American people could trust it. But my concern is 10 years from now, there are people passing on information and no one seems to know where the information came from.
Right.
It's just circulating. And so this is, why I've always emphasized that you have to go back and fact check everything. You have to find the origins of it. You have to do your history. You have to know your history, and you have to go and do your research to confirm what is the origin of this, because, this whole conversation started about, talking about polls and so forth. And there's a creator, some guy named David Pacman,
David
Pacman,
Pacman. Yeah.
he published something, a video, I think it was yesterday, where he was talking about all of the polls in the swing states. And I went and looked at his source of polling data, and I'm just like, really, people? Come on, seriously? And yet the whole story was manufactured. Like there was no story there, because at the end, all David Pacman said was, yeah, it's going to be close. And a separation of about 1%. But the reality is that's the way all presidential elections go. That's not news, but because he's grabbing these pieces from different places, like who is the company that's doing the poll? Who are the people behind it? Who is David Pacman himself?
Right.
You ask these questions of the content that you're consuming so you can evaluate whether or not it's worth it for you to pay attention to it.
I will say this about David Pacman. I watch a lot of different people, and I'm not in love with anybody out there. David Pacman is well regarded as a legitimate guy, but people have to understand there is a term that was used back in the broadcasting business where I wanted to do something. Well, you can do that, but you got to continue to feed the beast.
Yeah.
You can have a day with nothing going on, so you got to come up with something, and it's
Yeah.
got to be compelling. So
Mm.
sometimes you will take something and turn it into something that it's really not,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
just
Yeah. Exactly.
kind of a slant on something. And
Mhm.
I think that's the problem with some creators. David Pacman, I listen to him. I don't listen to him a lot because it takes too long to get to the point, but he's supposed to be regarded as legitimate. I know a lot of people do. And I'm not saying don't watch him or don't watch anybody else. Watch whoever you want. But understand that sometimes there are some days, I don't know about you, but there are some days I got nothing to talk about.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I try to talk about something, just re-talk about or reiterate something that I've talked about in the past, just so
Yeah.
it sets home. But some people will, we got to get the big views. We got to do this. We got to grab whatever
And
and turn it into
what's so
whatever.
weird about that is that you never have the same, it's very rare to have the exact same people watching you every single day for every single video. You know what I mean? You never know when it's showing up in people's news feeds. And the reality is that, like, I could probably talk about the Electoral College every single day and
Yeah.
still have people who have not seen that video twice.
Yep.
And so, and especially if you're going to do any kind of education of people, like those are the days where you get into talking about, okay, we haven't had the opportunity to talk about this, so let's talk about the three branches of government. I mean, like little refresher courses on stuff instead of constantly taking whatever is the sensational thing of the day. It's like, go find out what is on the docket, what is on the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court docket for what are the cases that they're going to be hearing, what is going on in the world, what races are coming up. I mean, this is just in the field of politics and
Yeah.
elections. What races are coming up at the local level that we might want to pay attention to? There's so much out there that doesn't have to involve all of this stuff that has no basis in fact.
That's one of the reasons when I started going on doing on TikTok, that wasn't
Mhm.
the end game for me. This doing the podcast was the end game for me because this is where I
Right.
feel the most comfortable because I'd been in
Mhm.
radio. But you're right, I can put something out and then somebody will come back and say, "Do you want to talk about this?" And I go, "I just did. Fucking, what do you want?"
Oh my God, I know. I have it every day.
It
You just
reminds
keep
it,
asking, can you talk about this? And it's like, I just uploaded that video 10 minutes ago. How did you not see it if you're talking to me right now?
it reminds me of being working at a shitty little radio station in Holbrook, Arizona, which is in northern Arizona, 5,000 people. It's 1979. I'm playing Cool in the Gang Ladies Night. Some
Oh my God.
and some kid calls me up and says,
Uh,
"Hey, could you play Ladies Night?" I go, "Bitch, it's playing right now. Turn on the right fucking station."
my God, that's so funny. I
But but
totally can relate.
but the point is that's the way
Yeah,
it is on TikTok. The
yeah,
advantage we have in doing the podcast, our listeners are more consistent. There are names I
yeah,
recognize every day.
yeah, yeah,
There's a woman who responds to every video, and I love her for doing that. She
yeah.
goes by Benny Loco. She'll probably freak out that I mentioned her name, but she's always there. And
Nice.
and this to me feels more like a home, so to speak,
Yeah,
because we're kind
yeah.
of building a family as opposed to
Mhm.
just throwing a shotgun effect out on TikTok.
Yeah,
The
totally.
TikTok was a means to an end. It was to get out there and get people to know who I am so they would come to the podcast.
Yeah,
And it's
yeah.
worked out pretty well in that regard. But
Nice.
yeah, you got to take TikTok for what it's worth. You got to pick and choose who you listen to and who you don't
Yeah,
listen to.
exactly.
And just
Yeah,
because they might be cute or they speak well, doesn't mean they know shit.
yeah.
I
Yeah,
mean,
you really do have to be careful because, I know that a lot of people have said that they've turned away from mainstream media and they're
mhm,
getting most of their news on TikTok. And I look at the caliber of content that's being generated, and it's not news. It is the regurgitation of stuff that in many cases has no basis in fact, or has editorializing going on about it that has no basis in fact, or is kind of like sort of true. Like there are some elements in the content that are true, but if you understood the history of that particular thing, or if you
right,
did some research, you'd realize that there was no story there.
right. Well, there's a lot of people that take a page from Donald Trump on TikTok. There's a lot of, it's like radio. When I was in radio, there's a lot of egos out there, and
Mhm.
and I try not to be wrong. I try to really figure out what's the truth is before I say it. It's either
Yeah.
my opinion or it's a fact, and I try to give both to the best ability. But when people say something wrong on TikTok or some of the other social media, they'll do what Donald Trump says. They won't admit they're wrong. They'll just ignore it or they'll double
Mhm.
down on it, which
Yeah,
is a disservice to anybody watching them.
totally, totally. Because the person watching is not going to understand the approach that the creator has taken to what they're doing with that piece of content, especially if you're going to double down on something. It's like, oh, that's a big mistake because you aren't even fact checking yourself. It's your ego that is either wounded because you've been taken to task for something, or you simply can't admit that you were wrong about something. I know that a couple of times I was even fact checking myself because after the fact I realized that I had given a number wrong where I had transposed a couple of numbers. It was so incidental and minor, it didn't matter, but it bothered me that it
Right,
wasn't
right,
absolutely accurate, and I just deleted the video.
right. One of the things too that I've learned in my long life and being married as long as I have, I'm not
Mhm.
fearful of being wrong. I will
Yeah,
be
me
wrong.
too.
I've
Yeah.
been married 41 years. I have two grown sons, and I have a 4-year-old granddaughter that will point out frequently that I'm wrong. And and so I've had to learn how to accept that. And if I come out here, what people don't understand is if somebody says, "Oh, this guy was wrong," and then he doubles down and say, "No, I wasn't really wrong because I heard it from this and then
Yeah,
this."
yeah,
People will think more highly of you if you say,
absolutely.
"Fucked up,
Well,
man.
they'll trust you more. They'll
Yeah,
trust. Yeah, that's the key is
I'm
do you
sorry I
have
fucked up."
trust? Yeah,
Yeah. A-
yeah,
And if more people could do that, but their egos won't allow them to
yeah,
do that. And that's what
yeah.
people have to understand. When you're watching the TV news, you're getting different stories from different media outlets. When you're watching um, people on TikTok or Facebook or wherever you're watching them, you're
Yeah.
dealing with just the average Joe. Some of them are really good. There are
Yeah.
there are some people on TikTok. I don't know if you've ever seen her. Um, there's a woman. She goes by the name of V,
Mm-mm.
and it's Under the Desk News. This
Oh, yes,
woman,
yes, I do know of her.
this woman is truly a journalist. Now, I don't know if I don't watch her enough to know that everything she does is right, but she's trying very hard to be
Yeah,
specific
yeah,
and to be straightforward.
absolutely.
I
Yeah,
would
agree.
I wouldn't I wouldn't question telling somebody to watch her. But there are
Yeah.
others out here that seemingly do the same thing that you and I do, but they
Mhm.
really don't because they have no uh, integrity about it. To them, it's going after followers, and that's the hard thing to
Yeah,
distinguish between people. Are they just trying to get popular and famous, or are they really trying to do something?
yeah, and that was the thing that I noticed that was a little bit troubling to me about TikTok is, it doesn't matter how many followers you have. It really only matters how many people are actually seeing the
Right.
content generating it. Like, some days you get 400,000 people on a video because the topic is really hot, and other days you get 2,000 people. So it's like there's no relationship between those numbers and the number of followers you have. And the reality is that the majority of your followers are not watching your videos anyways, because it's so easy to click follow on something. But if it doesn't show up in your news feed, I've seen people's profiles where they're following like 10,000 people. And it's like, well, how long ago was it that you followed any of those people? Because their stuff certainly isn't showing up in your feed. So, my feeling is that there's kind of like this divide where, um, like people are trying to use TikTok to launch them into something else,
Right.
like that
Like a
they're going to,
podcast.
well, no, because the
It's true
podcast
though. It's true though.
it is, but it's different from like people will set up a TikTok account and then they're wanting to create a lead generation strategy because then at some point they're going to start selling merchandise, and then beyond that then they're going to start selling coaching programs, and then they're
Right.
going to
Right.
start selling retreat programs, and there's like a sort of strategy, a totally legitimate strategy, with TikTok being the lead generation thing. But when I look at it from the perspective of content, and that people are coming there because they're looking for information, I see it more like a Google,
Yeah.
like that the content is there to be consumed because it's there for the consumer, not that it's there because somebody's going to benefit off of it.
Right. Have
It's like
you
this teaching environment, you know what I mean? But that's because I used to be a teacher, I guess.
Have you experienced the problem that a lot of people with a lot of followers have? You have 200,000 followers in a short period of time. And I will
Right.
say, how many followers, people say, "Oh, you got a lot of followers. You must be." No, it's not that. I mean, it's nice.
Yeah.
I appreciate it, but I don't get too caught up in it because it
Yeah,
really
you
doesn't
can.
mean that much. But have you experienced the things that many of us are experiencing where there are imposters out there?
Oh my God, I get them every day.
I do too. And
Yeah.
they take my name, they take my videos, they take everything from me,
Yep.
and then they go reach out to people trying to benefit from whatever
Scamming them. Yeah,
credibility I
they're
have,
absolutely
trying to sell
scamming.
them crypto. Every day I get people saying, "Are you selling crypto?" No, I'm
Yeah,
not selling you anything. I
that's right.
won't sell you anything. And I've got
Yeah,
380,000 followers. I'm not reaching out to individuals to try to
that's
start a
right. Like,
conversation.
That's right. You know, you've got that many followers, you're generating that much content, you've got so much going on. It's not like you're spending any time sending a direct message to somebody to, ask them where they live and, inviting them to this scam over on Telegram and all this other stuff. And I always say to people, look, it's me because I don't follow anybody and I never message anybody. I'll reply to a message infrequently, but I never message anybody because, I'm busy.
Yeah, I've said that too, and you're probably experiencing that now. Um, when you have a bunch of content and a bunch of comments, I'll go
Yeah.
through and I'll try to like the ones I like,
Yeah.
but to enter into a conversation
You
in those
can't.
I can't, I got to do it on
Too
TikTok and
many.
YouTube and all that. It's very difficult to do that.
Yeah.
I will tell you this, I'm sure you don't have this problem, but I do. A lot of people, a lot of guys my age, um, when I get a DM from a scantily clad 20 something girl who wants to get to know me, I'm sorry, honey, I'm gonna have to break your heart. I'm not talking to you. First of all, I'm
No,
married. Second of all, I'm not buying this shit.
you know what? I get the opposite where it's unbelievable. The photos are, it's always men, it's always older men, and they always have these like um, the Marlboro Man
Yeah,
picture.
yeah.
And every single message, first of all, it's always got spelling mistakes. And they're always trying to tell me, oh, I'll pay you $10,000, if I can just have this or that. I mean, fortunately, none of them have been inappropriate in certain ways. It
No
is more
feet
just,
requests, huh?
yeah, no feet requests. Um, yeah, but earlobes and whatever,
Wow.
But
Wow.
no, I don't get any creepy stuff. I get a lot of accounts because you never know who's behind these accounts.
Right.
But it's like, oh, you have such beautiful eyes, blah, 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 blah. You just need the right man and $10,000. I mean, oh my God, you know what? If I just look at the profile photo and the messages are coming in, I already know who it is, and then I just delete all of it.
Whenever I get those from the girls, I always go look at their page just to see if they might be legit. Because I have a
Yeah.
rule when people DM me, I get people DMing me videos all day, every day,
Oh
and
my God, me too.
I can't watch them. But if
Yeah.
somebody takes the time to actually write words, I will
Mhm,
read it
mhm.
and respond
Yeah,
if it's
yeah,
appropriate, if I
yeah, me
can.
too.
But when you go to those pages of these young women and you see these rows and rows of 50 and 60-year-old men buying into
Yeah,
this, oh, she likes me.
yeah,
Come on, fuck
totally.
you.
It's such an environment for scam artists and stuff. Yeah, it's unfortunate that it's like that, but fortunately for us and the people that follow us, 99% of them, they're there looking for learning and knowledge and reassurance and stuff, and that we can provide that to them. And hopefully they can feel that we're trusted sources of
Yeah,
information and insight and analysis, and that we will all get through this election. And then come November 5th, it will be over.
we will get through it. It'll be over. All the delays and all the protection
Yeah,
that the
it's all
Republicans and
done.
Donald Trump, it'll
We're
be all
almost
gone.
done.
We're
All
almost
that's
done.
left is the vote.
2 weeks. Well,
Yeah.
Arlene, thank you very much for
Oh,
joining
Mike,
me on the
thank you
show.
so much. Such a pleasure as always. Thank you again. I love having this time with you. It's so different when you're just making videos each day and everything, and you don't have that interaction with anyone.
Yeah,
This is what I love when I interview people. I may be just listening most of the time and asking a few questions, but it's very nice to have that direct interaction and exchange. It's quite satisfying. So thank you for that.
well, no, people loved it when you were on the program, and I've gotten to the point now that people, again, a responsibility. People are depending on the podcast to be there,
Yeah.
and I made the horrible mistake of thinking I could do a podcast every day. So now I do one every day.
Oh my God.
An hour, hour and a
Woo!
half every day, and I have a lot of guests on, and I always appreciate the guests because, frankly, when it's just me, I'm bored to tears. I'm bored
Yeah.
with me. So I
Yeah.
like having other people on, especially
Yeah.
when they're smarter than me, and most of all of them are, and it makes me look good. But the thing about it is, have you ever had a day when you didn't do TikToks? You just had shit going on, you didn't do a TikTok?
No, you know what? I always, well, you know what? For me, a lot of it has to do with what's happening in the news.
Right.
and there's been news every day. So I always figure out a way. What happens for me is I don't have a regularly scheduled time that I post.
Yeah.
It could happen, at 8 in the morning. It could happen 4 in the
Right.
afternoon. So it's not that I miss it. I just don't have a set schedule for when I'm publishing.
Well, uh, I had one day where I didn't do any TikToks because my son was getting married. I had to be the officiant. We were a little, and then I babysat my granddaughter after I was a little
Yeah.
booked up, and I didn't do it. And there was one time recently where I did a podcast, and I screwed up. I got the audio portion up on Spotify, but I didn't get the video up
Uh-huh.
on YouTube. And because of my age, the first thing people are going, "Oh my God, what happened?" They think I fucking died. They think Mike's dead. What? It's not even November 5th yet. So you
That's
talk about responsibility. I got to be there, man. Otherwise I'm in trouble. Well,
yeah.
Arlene, thanks for coming by.
Oh,
Like
it's
I
my
say,
pleasure, Mike.
we're happy to have you anytime. We get a lot of people that come on very frequently and some infrequently, and we just soon have you more frequently, especially as we get closer to
Yeah.
November 5th.
Yeah,
And
we'll talk, you know what, maybe we can do a session just before the election where we can talk about what people should be looking for on election night at the
right.
returns are coming in.
Absolutely. And at some point after I'm going to be in Washington D.C. from uh, November 7th to the 10th. I'm talking to a group of people, and I'm excited because I wanted to be in D.C.
Oh,
right after
nice.
Donald Trump gets his ass kicked. But maybe
Yeah,
we should have a show sometime after the election where
yeah.
just you and I laugh and say I told you so.
Yeah, yeah, I'll crack open the champagne.
Because I am that guy that will say I told you so.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, I'll be right there with you.
all right. Well, Arlene,
Thanks, Mike.
thank you very much for
All
those
right,
of you
take
listening.
care.
I hope you have a great day. We'll talk to you again tomorrow.